Good. I think we should start. Welcome everyone to the roundtable on transversality beyond the international and the global, but then what question mark. This is a roundtable that we organized for the transnational hub of doing international political sociology and also for the EISA section on doing international political sociology. It's the second one we have organized. We did one on the international a few months ago, I believe. So this one focuses on transversality. We've got a number of speakers here. I'll talk you through the format that we use in a second, but let me first introduce you. I also forgot to put an end time on it, I've noticed, because we have now a default position of running these for 2 hours, but we'll run it for an hour and 40, an hour and 45 minutes. So around 3:45, we'll act local time here, we'll finish. So about an hour and 45 minutes, I think. Good. So this roundtable is part of a series of roundtables that we set up in which we try to explore concepts, approaches that IPS has been using to escape the re-territorialization within which we find ourselves often when we try to reimagine boundaries or to think beyond the international and the global. So it starts from an understanding that IPS has been an effort, now quite a long-standing effort already, to articulate a critique of dogmatic conceptualizations of the international as a site of politics. And so in doing that, it has engaged in multiple ways with challenging borders and boundaries, and actually also thinking in terms of borders and boundaries, and has opened up an agenda for thinking differently in terms of a plurality of flows, issues of multiplicity, heterogeneity, how you think about relations and connections without having them actually somehow, when we think about the political and the social, bring them back into some legacy of the sovereign polis or the sovereign polity, if you want, and the social within the classical society or society-state relations. And one of the terms that is regularly pops up or is referred to in international political sociology is transversality. And so we thought it would be a good idea to set up a roundtable to move the discussion on transversality or to get a sense about what is meant by transversality. And obviously that is not one thing meant by it, but to have a discussion about it, because transversality is a way of examining processes beyond conventional topologies and topographies of scales, and to actually start thinking about a fracturing of the international and the global. So what does it mean to think beyond the international and the global? And so this roundtable is the first attempt. I'm sure we'll do some more in the future to start, and it's not the first attempt in IPS, but it's the first attempt in our series to actually start thinking around the notion of transversality, what it means, how people actually fill in this notion of transversality. And that is why we have asked the speakers not to just reflect on transversality in general, but we asked them to select what you could call a category, a conceptual device, an approach through which they work transversally, or they work transversality in their research. And so we have 5 speakers and 5 of these categories through which transversality is being taught. So first is Angela Kloss-Stevens from Swansea University, and her, let me call it, conceptual device is affect. Then we have Jonathan Austin from the Graduate Institute of International Relations, Geneva, and his conceptual device is composing. Then we have Linda Monsis from École Normale Supérieure, and her concept is controversy. João Nogueira from PUC Rio, and his concept is faults. And then we have Didier Biege from Sciences Po Paris and King's College London, and his device is centrifugal dynamics. And so the way this will work is that I will ask people questions, the speakers questions, and they will have each 5 minutes to respond, to reply to it. And then we open up the floor for your questions, see if you have some comments in relation to what has been said. And we follow up from there. And I'll try to do very good timekeeping so that we can move through the different questions in time. So at some point I will say, okay, fine, let's move on to the next question. So we have a set of questions for that. Can I also suggest we have consciously not done the standard thing where everybody is hidden and everything is super controlled. But can I suggest that if you have questions, you can use the chat, but I actually would prefer that you put up your hand or set a note in the chat, like in any other normal situation that we have in face-to-face, where you then can speak your question. I think that will make for more a better way of interacting between us. Good. I think that's all I need to say about the format and what we are up to. Yeah, that's all I need to say. So we can start then. So the first question is, it's really quite a general question. It has to do with this idea that IPS is seeking to think beyond boundaries, borders, and so on, or deal with these in a different way. And so the question is, how does the conceptual device that you selected challenge the understanding of social and political spaces as constituted to bordering and through rendering boundaries? Or how does it challenge thinking, politics and the social, mainly in terms of inside and outside, and the games that are done between inside and outside, which is the element about borders and boundaries being so central. And so we're going to start with Ankarat, 5 minutes, and how her concept of affect speaks to this. Over to you, Ankarat.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everyone. It's really nice to be here, and I'm looking forward to hearing from my fellow panelists too. So I decided I'd start off by just going through a story where I felt that affect helped me to think politically about this story or this event, this moment where the local and the global came together for me in everyday life. And it's from 2016 when I moved house from Newcastle in the north of England to Swansea in Wales. Also the year when we were at the height of the so-called refugee crisis, when we had the Brexit vote in the UK and the election of Donald Trump. And I was invited by a new friend to a cinema, an independent art cinema, was showing a film called In This World by the director Michael Winterbottom. And it follows the treacherous journey made by a father and son from Pakistan to the UK. And the whole evening was designed to raise money for refugee support groups working in Samos, Greece, as well as people living in Aleppo, Syria. So we packed in this room and we'd all obviously turned out and decided to pay because we wanted to be good citizens that could do something in response to this humanitarian emergency taking place in the Mediterranean Sea, and which we were seeing on the screens every night at that time. So the film is harrowing, as you might know or might expect, but liberal-minded audiences are used to being shocked in these kinds of ways. People were also keen to stay after the film and ask what could they do. And the team organising the evening had arranged that a father with his family who'd arrived in Swansea through the UK Syrian Vulnerable Persons Relocation Scheme would describe his own journey from Syria via Calais to Swansea. He spoke eloquently and gently, and at this point, the geographies of distance and proximity were already starting to become more complicated. But this must have been a strange and not untroubling experience for him to be introduced to us, this earnest audience, in this way. But what stayed with me from this evening was that what emerged after the screening was disagreement. So the organisers were asking us whether we could donate large items such as old ovens or bits of carpets to other people who had just arrived in this city and who needed to do up their flats or their houses. And at this point, one person in the audience put up her hand and said that she had been saving for new household items and waiting for years for her landlord to make essential repairs, including attending to damp walls. Amongst this great desire to be generous, questions emerged in the audience about why poor nomads should be prioritized over poor residents. These are Etienne Balibar's terms. I just watched, new to this city and teaching in the daytime about these very issues of imaginative geographies of us and them. But what I was most struck by was how this huge goodwill was shifting really quickly, but in these very microscopic ways, and how things could at any point have gone in either direction. So we might say that the film taps into a genre of kind of showing us horror and then thinking we'll be moved to act. But people like Vicky Squire, who I see is here today, has warned us to be suspicious of that kind of politics of pity and what it does. So what I want to address, or what I felt that affect helps me address, and I'll go on to unpack in other answers, was something that Emma McCluskey touches on too in her book From Righteousness to the Far Right. And that's where she describes how a particular type of kind of exclusionary, securitarian politics that I could have theorized on this evening to sort of say how these imaginative geographies of us and them were coming back into view, how people were being seen as othered, as distant, and so on. They wouldn't have helped me to also see how, in complicated ways, the same people who were being resistant or defensive were also then willing to help out or willing to chip in. So I was looking for a way of writing about global politics that could, to borrow from McCluskey here, be as empathetic to the people on the screen as to the new arrivals to the city, and also to these local populations who are trying to figure out where they fitted in these dynamics. This is something that McCluskey talks about looking for in her study too. Something that could help her address the plasticity and fluidity of boundaries is how she describes it. Or what I've written here as something that would help me understand how ideas about inside and outside were dominant and in the room, but were also unstable, mobile, buoyant. They were flowing through emotions, they were lively, and they were changing in the whole time that we were sat there together with different effects. So Jeff, if that's okay, I started with a story just to sort of raise some of the issues about the local and the global, the distance and proximity, the role of emotions in world politics, but mainly to get at this question of the plasticity and fluidity of these boundaries between inside and outside.
Thank you, Angrat. That's excellent. Jonathan?
Yep, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, perfect. Thanks very much to Jeff and everybody for organizing. So I'm talking about composing or composition as a concept of relevance to transversality, IPS, etc. So fundamentally, to answer the question, the concept of composition to me asks how borders or boundaries or insides or outsides can disappear through mutual encounters between objects that create sort of composites of entities. And in the past, I've talked about this somewhat theoretically about the idea of symbiosis, the ways in which disparate things or fragments that flow and circulate can become partially connected in often unexpected ways and find a sort of mutual resonance between one another. And for me, the term became of interest at first because of its prominence in the philosophy of Deleuze and Guattari. So let me begin with them to explain where I'm going. For Deleuze and Guattari, what defines thought or thinking or theorizing, whether artistic, scientific, or philosophical, they say, is the task of confronting chaos. But how do you confront chaos, the chaos of the world? One option is to revert indeed to structuralist images of the international or the global that Jeff and Zhao and lots of people have talked about as being problematical and things IPS tries to move beyond. But Deleuze and Guattari are not speaking in these terms. They start with the idea of confronting chaos as a prerequisite for all forms of thought and thinking. If meaning is to be injected into the world, we require some form of ordering device. But it doesn't need to rest on harsh lines and boundaries of insides or outsides. There are alternatives, as we just heard about very eloquently. But for me, the concept of composition grasps at the alternatives most strongly, given its links precisely to the artistic, the aesthetic, and the affective, the obvious linkages between composing and the artistic. An artist generally takes disparate little objects, fragments of paint, plastics, materials, ideas, and tries to find somehow a way of bringing them into a composition that produces resonance for the artistic piece as a whole. And that task necessarily involves thinking beyond boundaries. Any work of art that mimetically copied the world, if that was possible, would be the least interesting form of art. So aesthetics is about the task of producing symbioses between elements that cut across otherwise self-evident differences. It produces something that confronts chaos without ever denying it. So to continue with Deleuze and Guattari, they say that the coordinates of assemblages are determined not by theoretical analyses implying universals, but by a pragmatics composing multiplicities. Composition is about this pragmatic bringing into contact of multiplicities, of creating pathways within assemblages that connect and unite chaos just a little bit. And crucially, this task is oriented, I think, around a strong appreciation for the frictions of social life that Anna Singh talks about very eloquently. It's not about denying chaos, but leveraging the frictions within that chaos, frictions between persons, objects, animals, ideologies, infrastructures, things that should not solely be considered indicators of boundaries or borders, but as sites of encounter that processually and unavoidably produce practices of mutual transformation, infiltration, and symbiosis. And it's these encounters at which moments of composition occur that I think can serve as one way of theorizing ways in which to reimagine transversely social and political spaces. The friction of these kind of compositional encounters implies difference, but also the possibility of thinking beyond it. So again, with Anna Singh, to focus on these spaces of composition allows us to ask about universals, not as truths or lies, but as sticky engagements, or as I'm calling them, compositions. This allows us to explore both radical difference and radical commonality, or the potential for it. But in doing so, I also want to stress that I think this asks us to reconsider our own practice as social sciences scientists, and the degree to which we are or are not taking seriously the specifically aesthetic consequences of thinking in terms of composition. It seems to me that part of the worry this opening question poses is not purely conceptual, but about the fact that the world still continues to think about itself in terms of classically an international society, whatever conceptually goes on. It's about this clash between conceptualization and politics. So the question that concerns me is how we might be able to compose a transversal understanding of the world that resonates beyond the borders of IPS. How can we compose IPS differently in aesthetic and effective terms? How can we make the transversal as a concept also an object of public debate, more broadly speaking? But that aside, as that speaks a little bit to the last question we have on the list, I just want to conclude with the words of the philosopher Michel Husserl, because the concept of composition, which is something he dwelled on a little bit, could be summarized in a paragraph where he lists certain imperatives for doing social science in this way. And I'll just quote him and conclude. Don't seek to know how to look at a landscape, compose a garden instead. Learn the aesthetic error of submitting everything to a law. Leveling the local event produces boredom and ugliness. A world without landscapes, books without pages. Take everything away and you won't see. To see space demands time, don't kill time. But avoid the symmetrical error of being satisfied with fragments. A lack of story is as tedious as a singular law. Composition requires a tension between the local and the global, the nearby and the far off, the story and the rule, the uniqueness of the world, the international expressway and remote villages, science and literature. Sometimes we require syntheses. When you do this, you see both in miniature and in panorama. And I'll stop there because I think I'm already over time.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm going to move on straight ahead, like, you know, like a train moving from station to station, or whatever the metaphor is that we want to use. Linda, over to you. Controversy?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the invitation. What I try to suggest here is the idea or the concept of controversies. I would emphasize the plural here. And I understand it as a very methodological concept in the sense that it tells us maybe something about how to conduct research, like where to look at and like, yeah, how to write it up then in the end. So controversies mainly as a methodology. I work with the idea developed by Michel Carlon about socio-technological controversies as these controversies that bring together the social and the technical in imaginations about possible futures. So these controversies are not to be understood as debates, as like pro-con debates where it's clear who has which position and who supports what kind of arguments, which I think speaks a lot to the previous two contributions. But it's more about these new imaginaries where different actors, technologies, ideas, practices are assembled and also challenged and put together in new imaginaries. And I think this is where the transversal aspect comes in this idea about how can these controversies reimagine, as Jonathan just said it, like reimagine or put forward a different kind of politics about conceptualizing politics, but also international politics. What could it mean? In my research on fake news, but also on cybersecurity, what becomes clear is that I think controversies are a good concept to show how, especially the idea of scales of inside and outside, are challenged and are reimagined, because in these controversies they are transcended by actors, by these narratives that bind together really like the big and the small, all in quotation marks, to these new imaginaries, where it's not clear if we talk about cybersecurity as an issue of global order or something that the user has to do at her end device. And these are all bound together in these controversies of, for instance, what kind of security do we want? So this is where I focus on. And I think studying controversies means to start with the actors and their perspective on a specific issue and their perspective on how they bind together different issues. But it does not mean to end there. And there, I think the politics part comes in the sense of that we have to then think about like how are these controversies embedded in other bigger controversies, but also how do they hang together? A question about flows and entities, I think, which we will talk about then later a bit more. And I think when we follow the lines of a controversy, the boundaries of sovereign states as institutions will be transcended, either because the actors themselves cross them or challenge them, go beyond them, or because the issue itself cannot really adequately be spoken of within the framework of traditional politics, as you see in, I think, a lot of contemporary issues that cannot be fully grasped when we just stay to this idea between internal, external, national, international. So I think controversies are a way where we can study how new imaginaries are developed, and also how the material, the technological, feeds into new political imaginaries, and also where they come together, but also where it becomes difficult to separate them when we, for instance, talk about algorithms, especially at the moment of the ethics and the politics of algorithms. I think here it becomes clear that these controversies are always debating these two dimensions, the social and the technical. So I hope later I can talk a bit more about the methodological aspect, but in like considering the time, I will stop here and then give the word to the next speaker.
Thanks, Linda. Joao, would you thoughts? Joao, your microphone is off.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone, for being here today. I will speak about the fold, which is a concept Jeff and I have been struggling with to think about resistance, but we think it's very interesting to think about differentiation in world politics. So one of the challenges, I think, of IPS has been, as the question states, to problematize borders and boundaries as the primary modes of differentiation in international politics. Hence, the distinctions between inside, outside that become constitutive of politics and subjectivity. So the field, as we've been looking at it, has, I think, advanced significantly in the past 2 decades in showing how these borders, or how borders in general shift, are sometimes broadened, enlarged. They certainly multiply, dislocate. And as such, they they engender new practices of discrimination in diverse and often not territorially bounded sites. So we know all this from a lot of the research done in IPS recently. So this multiplication, or diffusion of all kinds of borders and boundary practices, allows to differentiate for different modalities, actually, of inside-outside relations, to instantiate all kinds of new spatialities of exclusion, confinement, control, surveillance, stratification, and so forth. So what we see is a reproduction of these different spatialities based on the clear distinction between inside and outside in many different sites. And as such, they allow for establishing new kinds of hierarchies, new relations of power, and also new kinds of modes of resistance. Another significant challenge to IPS has been to rethink power relations, as I was saying. So how do you actually frame these relations which are non-territorial, which are displaced, which are not centralized, and mostly often constantly shifting? So how do you think about this? What's the conceptual apparatus that you can deploy to think these multiplicities in all these different spaces? So significant efforts, I think, have been made to imagine new forms of resistance, be it in analysis of counter power practices, analysis of everyday modes of resistance, and so forth. So when we think about resistance, and Jeff and I have struggled with the analytical frameworks that frame resistance as opposition or negation to dominant power configurations. So we try to think about politics or counter politics, or politics that face certain configurations of power in terms that would allow us to escape a logic of opposition and negation, because we think it often reproduces those very constellations of power they try to resist to. So one possible alternative to this duality, the power resistance duality, is to conceptualize these relations as folded. So here we introduced the notion of fold. So we try to conceptualize these relations as folded into each other, relations of power resistance. But we take the concept from Deleuze, for whom the fold and folding is a way to think about connections, especially in how the inside is connected to the outside. So we think it's a fruitful way to think about the inside not as another realm or another distinct space from the outside, but actually, or as a fixed limit, which is often the way we think about the relationship between inside and outside, but rather as folds and foldings making up an inside. So they're not anything other than the outside, but precisely the inside of the outside. So as you fold a piece of paper or you fold anything, you know, the outside surface becomes the inside. This is a very simple illustration that Deleuze utilized in his lectures on Leibniz and the Baroque. So the inside is nothing more than a fold of the outside. So through the fold, we can think about differentiations, not in terms of breaks and ruptures, but as a process of disjunction, which is constantly in movement and flux. So to make it brief, because this is a complex concept, we're trying to think about resistance as power folded into itself, instead of the opposition of two forces that confront each other or resist to each other in a segmentary or hierarchical way. So that's how the fold helps us think about resistance in international politics, which is a challenge in itself, but also how to think about the inside and the outside. It's folding, it's a way of connecting without separating, I would say. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Joao. Didier, over to you. Centrifugal dynamics.
Yes. I will do like a detective story. So I will explain centrifugal dynamics at the end on the on the fourth question. Well, what I wanted was to come back to what is our interest. At least my interest is about the way to think form of power and regime of justification as relations, circulating, expanding, retracting, and which are reconfigured in socio-historical context, how they are changing in time. So I fight against other vision of power, essentialist vision, accumulation and ownership, the old Marxist logic, transcendental origin, or teleological future. And sometimes I'm not sure that we all agree about that some of the presentation will come back to this kind of vision. So for me, relation of power, for example, transect lines, but they do not necessarily produce a beyond by new areas, by fragment in forms of bubbles, or using the Deleuzian logic of healing. So large part of authors continue, in my view, with the idea of a globalization process creating homogenization effects. I know that sometimes the discourse is different, but they continue if you speak about hegemonic structuration in favor of centers and exclusion of the margins. And that's really what I would like to see as not IPS. So this approach, which go from the global north versus global south, or geopolitics of new Cold Wars, or a way of racialization instead of intersectionalization, always recapture a form of binary logic. And that's the danger with the beyond. Beyond is very often coming back to what was before, and the beyond and before are too much connected. So I insist maybe more on the importance of the international as a distribution of spatial configuration organized along boundaries and border guards patrolling the field to create and benefit from cost of entry, be they around territorial boundaries, financial boundaries, intellectual boundaries. And the last are maybe the most subtle, but also the most obvious in some case. So I agree that transversal is crossing boundaries of the international. They transect. I resist this idea of beyond. Therefore, the central mechanism would be who draw, control, patrol the boundaries, who are the spokesperson, and the answer I propose is nobody. It's not a who, which will be the dominant ones. It's not the designer. It's not the most powerful. It's the result of all the relation between the actors. And so the idea is to analyze the field into their enlarged interdependencies. And this come back in some way to Norbert Elias as much as other researchers that I will develop later. And I stop there. I will explain centrifugal dynamics from that.
Okay, thanks Didier. Thanks everyone. So what we do now is that there's a whole lot here already, and I think it will actually be developed. So there is a moment now in which you can actually ask questions, raise disagreements, ask for clarifications, or whatever you want to do. We do about 10 minutes of these. If there are people who have questions, can I propose you put up your hand or put a note in the chat if you want to ask a question, want to contribute to the discussion? Renata, who I forgot to introduce, also from PUC-Rio, is actually keeping an eye on who is putting up hands. Nobody has anything to say? Yeah. If you don't have a hand, just wave your hand or put something in the chat. Because I lose sometimes my hand here as well. Yeah, Renata. The person who is on Victoria Mikkelsen.
Yes, I'm trying to. Okay. Ask you on mute.
Yes, there we go.
Okay.
Thank you. Hi there, Sarah. I'm not Victoria. I'm Nick.
No, I know. So it's just that Renata could find you.
I can get my wife's name off my Zoom account. There we go. Anyway, hello. So I had a general question. It only comes up in a couple of them. So I'm interested in what the relationship of Deleuze to IPS is.
Okay. Anyone else has a comment? There is another person here. Alexandra Spalnitska.
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Unfortunately, I apologize, but my camera is broken, so this is the reason you cannot see me. But thank you for your discussion. It's very stimulating and inspiring, and I would like to refer to what was said a while ago about being beyond and before at the same time. And actually, it's very interesting for me because new medievalism is a conception with which I'm dealing in my own academic work, and actually it is referring to both beyond and before, because it is constructed upon the historical analogy between the postmodern globalized world and pre-modern medieval Europe in terms of logics of ordering and construction of authority. So this idea is in some way coming across borders and beyond borders of states, of course, and as well as so to say mental borders of modernity in terms of how we think about politics, but also is going before, so it's in context of this analogy to the pre-modern times. That's a short comment.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? No. Does any of the speakers want to pick up on either of these?
There is a question to CG, to Linda from, okay, here. Should I?
Yes.
Allow?
Yeah,
okay.
Katja has a question as well.
Hi, thank you. I'm curious, when you're speaking about, Linda, when you're speaking about the socio-technological controversies in particular, are you distinguishing between the controversies about the subject of technology or the controversies that get produced because of technology? Now, I'm not sure, just, is that clear, that distinction that I'm trying to? Okay, thanks.
Okay. There's also Katja still. And there's a question
Thank
by
you.
Gavin
Oh,
as well. But
sorry.
Gavin, I think your question will come back to, but let's ask it anyway now. But we'll come back to in question 3 when we talk about decentering power. Katja, first.
Okay, thanks. Hi, this is a question to whoever mentioned imaginaries, and I think it was mentioned several times. And I was wondering what role they play in terms of what ontological status they have, what they can do, and where you would place imaginaries in the different understandings that you have. Because in my understandings, imaginaries can sort of be something that produces something new or leads to a production of something new, alternatives, but I was wondering how you understand them. Thanks.
Thank you. Gavin, and then we'll go quickly to the panelists and move on to the next question. Gavin formulated, so Jonathan, can you say more about how you understand power in the practice of compositions you describe? But I assume, Jonathan, you're going to come back to that when we come to question 3 on descent, or maybe already the second question coming in. Okay, any of the panelists wants to quickly reply? Yeah, Didier, you can actually unmute yourself. I've made you co-host. Oh yeah, you're on still. You shouldn't be muted.
Yeah. Yes, I think the beyond and before and new medievalism is one of the problems. It's not, it's a way to continue with the logic of line. It's not because it's not a straight line, but if you do a circle, this is not a transversal line. This is a circle line. And that's where I think we can really discuss about the logic of boundaries. For me, it's exactly the contrary of what I try to do. So historicity certainly, but this kind of reorganization of the past and the new by analogy is certainly for me one of the teleological problem that is the canon of modernity and certainly not a critic. Well, Rob Walker will say that better than me, certainly with more subtle terminology, but we agree on that.
Okay, anyone else wants to come back? You got the question on Deleuze, you got the question on imaginaries, controversies.
Yeah, I can maybe start. Yeah, so I think it's usually more interesting or more like, yeah, my personal research interest is usually more about controversies that bring together a controversy about technology and the social. And of course, I understand that at least within the last years, I think there's more and more interest and maybe a bit of a hype about controversies that play out through a distinct technology. This is how I understood your question. I think both dimensions are relevant. And to come to this, to try to also answer the question about imaginaries, I think these controversies become then really interesting when they develop imaginaries that produce alternative ideas about politics, about reordering certain ideas about legitimacy, responsibility, and these things. This is where my interest lies. And I think then these controversies can become really interesting, and I think that's kind of already like the next question, when they interestingly reproduce certain ideas at points where it's kind of surprising that they stick to really maybe ideas about social and political ordering that are that don't fit maybe the problem at hand, or seemingly don't fit that problem. So I think this is where these imaginaries become relevant for me.
Anyone else? Joao? Veronica, I saw you as well. We'll come back in a second. But let's, Joao?
Me first?
Yeah.
Why don't you let Jonathan first?
Did Jonathan? Oh, I didn't see. All right.
I don't mind. You can go, Joao.
After you, Jonathan, always.
Okay, I didn't have something very eloquent to say, but I was going to answer the question on Deleuze and the place in IPS. So it's interesting, and I know you've written quite a lot about this, Nick, using Deleuze. So my response would be a little bit sociological in terms of the sense that Deleuze underlies a lot of the stuff that's come into IPS through different names. A lot of the turns towards, STS, different things. There's a lot of Deleuze going on in the background. Even work on entanglement, ecological stuff, you can see the very strong intellectual lineage of Deleuze. It's been less explicitly taken up as compared to, say, Bourdieu or Foucault. And my answer is because Deleuze is extremely difficult to read. And so it's very difficult to situate Deleuze within IPS, within a coherent frame, because of the way the philosophy is designed to be creative through concepts, makes it very difficult to import totally into IPS, or to any field, in fact. Other fields do it slightly better. In critical geography, you get a lot more kind of, I think, productive deployments of Deleuze in different sections, but IPS finds it difficult to some degree. And I think it's happening slowly, but a lot of this thing is about the investment in reading Deleuze is extremely difficult. So that's my sociological answer. So like Deleuze is in the background of a lot of things that are going on and have been going on for a while and extremely complementary to everything else. But the question is, teaching Deleuze is extremely difficult, reading Deleuze is difficult. So where it will actually end up being situated, I'm not certain in general. But Zhao, you probably have something to add to this.
Not much, John. I think I really agree with you. As you said, Deleuze is present in many of the concepts created by IPS or invented by IPS. Transversal lines, which is the title of one of the handbooks on IPS, draws on the concept originally from Guattari, but also developed by Deleuze when thinking about assemblages, but also about folds and lines of flight. But I agree with you that it's difficult to elaborate, formulate an analytics of the transversal through Deleuze. So, I mean, there's clearly more work done based on other authors that are the basis of IPS, but it's been difficult. Jeff and I have tried to rethink structure through Deleuze, which is, I think, very important to do away with totalizing narratives about the international system, about the global, and about power in general, or historicism that are still very present in the field. And I think it's one way of dealing with the problem of differentiation between levels, of course, but also between the inside and outside. But I also would venture the notion that Deleuze might be considered a line of flight in IPS. A line of flight in the sense that it tends to disarticulate a little bit or destabilize certain notions that are dear for IPS, especially notions that are more based on the stability of system boundaries, or what boundaries do, or the way we think about assemblages, or more or less stable configurations of relations that are more or less reproduced. The notion of fields also, which is very reproductive of certain distributions of power relations. So I think also the difficulty is when dealing with Deleuze in politics in general, because it's very difficult to think about it. But in IPS is the stronger lines of IPS in a certain, how can I say, cartography of lines that at times tend to become more stable than what a Deleuzian analysis would allow for. But that's just speculation. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks all. Veronica, is your question immediately related to this? Yeah. Just ask your question and then we'll move on. I'll take the answer to the question afterwards because we need to move on now. So if you can ask your question.
Yes, thank you. My question is to João. I would like for him to expand a little bit more on the inside-outsides logic at the national and regional levels. So within the level of the state, of the national states. if you could.
Perhaps, Jeff, perhaps we could address that when we talk about structures.
I think so. We'll come back to that when you come to the descent and the next question maybe as well. So let's move on. Yeah, we'll come back to that one. The next question brings us back to the international in international political sociology. So it's a question of how transversality contributes to re-envisioning the international as a less restrictive political space, or more provocatively, whether when you do transversality, can the concept of the international survive transversal analysis? Does it mean still anything when you do transversality as the way into studying social and political relations? Yeah. I promised we would change the order slightly. So we'll start with Jonathan, then Linda, then Joao, then DJ, and then Ankrat.
Yeah, okay. Can I ask the question back? What did you mean by less restrictive political space? Because this is what I got stuck on.
You can interpret as you will. I mean, it's the idea that the international system, the international works through the understanding of politics through sovereignty. And therefore the inheritance of the imagination of a territorialized, bounded polity that is there, and a flat structure of relations between these polities that has taken place. And so the idea was whether it's a less restrictive one. But the more provocative question is actually, I mean, the one that really emerges in my mind is if you do transversal analysis, what does the international still mean, or can it mean something? If you somehow work radically rethink or work beyond, or no, maybe we shouldn't use beyond, but different from the inside outside, if you work with pathways and other lines rather than circles or lines that cut, what remains of the international? Does it mean anything still?
And just as a reference, Jonathan, actually it's a reference to Didier's and Rob's article in 2007. They do speak of a less restricted topology. Didier might want to clarify that later. So, sorry, John.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I got a bit stuck on the word restrictive and the way we some of the concepts move between, are we thinking conceptually, analytically in terms of how we think about these things? Clearly, it makes it less restrictive. But then if we're talking about this idea of sovereign states and, the political system, and then to go back to what Didier was talking about, the possibility of beyond political change, different things, then no, to me, the concept of transversality actually, to some degree, makes the international more restrictive in terms of understanding political agency, possibilities of resistance. So I actually think one of the tendencies to fall back on binary thinking, the idea that we fall back to these different categories, which we see in different sides of IPS, Didier went through a few of them, comes from the fact that it's much easier to imagine going beyond outside transversality. And in that sense, the international is less restrictive. The international allows you to imagine political revolution. It allows you to imagine the overthrow of what went before. It allows you to imagine all these different possibilities because precisely the enemy is extremely clear cut, and it doesn't follow this logic of these intersecting lines, of the ways in which things work through different compositions of effect, of aesthetics, of practices, etc. And this touches a little bit on the third question, but in terms of these reproductions of hierarchies, exclusions in different fragmented spaces, to me this makes the restriction actually slightly more difficult to deal with, the restriction of the spaces through which politics occurs at whatever level we're calling it now, the transversal, the global, the international. Somehow this makes it more restrictive. I think it's correct. If we move to the level of kind of analyzing the world, I think this is how it should be analyzed. But at another level, it makes it more restrictive in terms of how you think about political change, which is why I think the last step of accepting transversality is very difficult to make. If you accept this understanding of fluidity and change, but also accept the power-saturated nature of it and the way it circulates around in different ways that do not have a particular center, that last step is very difficult to make because it actually brings back the question of the restriction of agency, of politics, of the possibility of change in one way or another. And the last concept in terms of the last question in terms of can it survive, the international survive its transversalization, I would actually probably leave this more to Linda and other people who talked about imaginaries and different things, because I think to me it's a question of, the international as a concept and as a political practice will survive. This is unquestionable. And this is precisely because as it itself is a transversal practice, it is transversely embedded, folded together in these ways. But I'll let other people who talked, to me it's very closely connected to this question of imaginaries. So I'll let other people who talked closely about imaginaries discuss that.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Linda?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, to make this connection, because I was just thinking like, wow, I really understood the question in a completely different way. But this gives me a nice point to start my thoughts on this, because I think on one level, I think it will survive in the sense of, or yeah, because it plays such a strong role in imaginaries, even about the future, and sometimes it's not the international, but the global, whatever you want to put in, but the ideas remain the same. And I think it's interesting how few spaces there are that imagine different ideas of political ordering, and how forceful this idea of the international is. And because I think this question, I mean, this is not the first roundtable on transversality, and I think we had that question already before. This is why I try kind of to link it back to my research to kind of show a little bit how I think a transversal analysis can look like and what it can show. And in my research on cybersecurity that I do with Tobias Liebetrau, we really come back to this idea that the issue at hand, cybersecurity, is nothing which can be really well understood either on an academic level or practical level with this idea of the national and the international. However, actors still come back to this idea and try to frame certain issues of data retention, surveillance, securitizing infrastructure in terms of these rather traditional ideas of politics. And I think what's interesting is when one then shows how this is contradicted by certain practices that make these, like, that are made possible by these technologies, that actually redistribute responsibility, legitimacy, that redistribute the ideas about what's public and private and what are the different roles in a political order for different actors. So these are the questions I would ask. And then I think the international comes in more as a way of how sticky it is. I think that was Jonathan's word from an earlier contribution, and how difficult it seems to be to go beyond, even if Didier doesn't like it, or go like to imagine something else. But I think it's, for me, it's always also an interesting empirical question of how these different dichotomies and ideas of political order are present in these practices, and in these practices that on the first look might transcend traditional political order, but then maybe might just be get read back into this. So this is how I answered or did not answer Jeff's question.
Thanks, Linda. Joao? No, microphone.
Sorry about that. Thanks. Yeah, I think it's interesting. Jonathan's answer was a bit unexpected, but I'll try to say something about how the fold helps us to think a new topology of the international. So I think the concept of the fold in this way privileges flows rather than segmentary lines. So this is how it distances itself a little bit from an international that is spatially well defined by boundaries that are more or less stable. So it privileges flows instead of lines, and how these flows are organized or structured or cut in this, constant movement of folding. So it helps us think topologically, and when we think topologically in a less restrictive way, it means of us looking at the topology not, as you mentioned, Jeff, not in such a flat perspective or just a distributive perspective, but of course in a three-dimensional space, but also that the three-dimensional space that takes into account what we would call the deformations of this space. So how it's differently shaped by turbulences, by vibrations, by tensions, by different articulations. So what we would call swerves, right? The topologies in the folds are always topologies of swerves, of sometimes entanglements, of and of course folding. So it privileges more a vision of a turbulent international, if you want, that's constantly in movement. So it's harder to think about the international as a discrete space. I mean, surely IPS does not think of the international as a discrete space, but surely as a different space. So a space that is differentiated from other spaces. So in this sense, the fold tries to complexify this process of differentiation that allows, in some perspectives, to think of the international as a constitutive outside, for instance, in terms spatially thinking, right? Or temporally thinking as a another perspective, if you want, on the origins of the international, or a critique of origins, but still temporality as somehow an articulation of continuities and discontinuities. So that's also a way to think historically about the international. So the fold in this sense, it's very topological, right? It really thinks in terms of its resonance sutures, the idea of suture that brings together multiple elements. So it really subscribes to the notion of multiple elements from inner and outer spaces, if you want, which are in contact with each other. So here the focus really is in how these contexts, based on either proximity, either other ways of touching, affecting, and so forth, how they are folded together. So in this sense, there's a strong emphasis on heterogeneity, on heterogeneous components that are, though, brought under a unifying viewpoint, which is not totalizing. So again, the international is a difficult concept because it invites totalization in a certain way and some form of homogenization. So it's difficult to think the international as fragmented. Transversality is interesting because it's mostly about bringing or articulating heterogeneous points or lines, or constantly, as Guattari would say, the transversal deterritorializes all the time. So it's really, it emphasizes resistance to these totalizations. So in this sense, it does privilege the transversal at that which comes first in experience, instead of segmentary lines. So maybe this is, of course, intuitive, but the international still somehow suggests that segmentary lines come first. And then we think about multiplicity and fragmentation. So the transversal tends to bring difference and multiplicity and heterogeneity first. And then, how these become cohesive in some kind of international space, that's a problem which is empirical mostly, but certainly contingent. So yeah, sorry about taking so long.
Thanks, Joao. Didier?
Yes, well, I will go on the same lines and Joao, maybe with different words, but for me, if we speak about transversality, it's to avoid the kind of state borders or boundaries, state, market, and so on, versus borderless, versus without border, versus global as with no border. And this kind of binary logic, whereby saying that you have no border, of course, you create discrimination even worse than when you have border and freedom inside the border. So I think it's really a very important epistemological question, because of course, what we see often in a series of new form of going the so-called beyond the state is going back to a borderless world or a flat world. For example, to speak only of connection and disconnection. And that's typically one of the problems of Bruno Latour. I don't know, I don't put all STS into Bruno Latour, but for Latour to have a Gabriel Tard vision of the world, so to reduce the social as the sum of interaction of objects in relation with individuals creates a problem. It's also a problem if you speak of the global as a new social world. That's Albert research. So homogenization, functional. For me, what you have into trans is certainly the idea that if it transects, it's because of struggle of power. And that's really important because if not, you just go back to nice functionalism and this violence of the neutrality that it enacts into politics, the kind of expertise vision of the political. So contrary to that, I insist that what is really important, and that's also topology, is to create a differentiation with the idea of bubble, Slaughter, or with the idea of circle, of enclosures, and to try to think differently the inside outside. I have proposed not the notion of fold, because I look at Deleuze and I think you have a problem, but more the one of the Mobius strip, and we can discuss about that maybe in other moment, because the Mobius strip is destabilizing, in my view, more than fold, because fold, you need a healing to have the fold. It's all, so you have all your diversity. So we agree a lot together, but I would prefer nevertheless the idea that because you have a one-dimensionality, which is reversible depending on the intersubjectivity of the people. So you include the observer inside your analysis of the Mobius strip. I would love to see how you put the observer into the fold. Where is your observer? Where are you into the fold? And I think we agree a lot about that. And that's the key notion to be transversal. It's to have something which is not reproducing borderless, because the both positions are form of violence. So I will, for me, transversal lines came from Kandinsky pictures. And it was a discussion with all the people about the transversal lines. So think about Kandinsky pictures and you will see that they never close something. They open, they transect, and you have also, if you want to have architecture, like Jonathan and Anna are doing, I will say it's the different Alhambra. The inside, outside are not defined by cube or by circle. They are coexisting. And this coexistence is not just a way of opposing them, but they can be there together simultaneously, coexisting. So I stop there.
Thanks, Didier. Ankarat?
Thanks, Jeff. It may be because I'm based in a different discipline, geography, or just based in this part of the world, and it may be different in other parts of the world. But politically, I don't hear much national at the moment. And I'd like to hear more claims made in the name of a discrete space called the international. The national is, in the context of the UK, so heightened as a frame at the moment for articulating any political claim, be that in terms of resistance, or if you're looking at the narratives of the government, that it's very hard to make a case for thinking internationally, let alone transversely. So just to note that depending on where we're starting from, I suppose, the international still has a value, I think, to bring back to the political as just this discrete space. But on the question, and I want to try and tie this concept of affect to imaginaries and come back to the question of resistance that several people have touched on. In thinking about affect as the bodily capacities to affect and be affected, as bindings and unbindings, I'm trying to get at something that's more than emotions and viewpoints, but about what Melissa Gregg and Greg Seaworth describe as the rhythmic attunements, connections, something that's central to politics as in part a process of people making and occupying space. It also helps me try and address the global politics of nationalism, which is my particular interest. So to think more about how objects, tunes, rhythms, and gestures play a role in political life. So, for example, I wanted to understand the role of, say, a baseball cap in the case when it was worn by the US president, how an object like that travels, moves people, says things, builds imaginaries, or a phrase such as making Britain great again, first used by Thatcher, reused now by Boris Johnson, the kinds of worlds that these phrases and gestures and objects create, which touches back on that question of why imaginaries matter. Then to go on to that, to go back to the question of resistance as well. I've been using some of Sarah Hughes's work in geography, where she talks about wanting to understand and theorize forms of resistance as something other than having intention, purpose, or involving action. So how else would we think about resistance? Or is it even possible to think about resistance building on some of Joao and Jeff's hesitations around the language of resistance, specifically hesitation in thinking about resistance as opposition, quite rightly, following a Foucauldian critique? Then how else might we think about what resistance might mean? So for me, I was thinking about that in the cinema. So for the people who went along, people wanted to do stuff, do good stuff, but not necessarily subscribe to any ideology or sign up to any movement or give themselves an identity or say that they were doing anything with full purpose. They just decided to go along. So how would we perhaps use language of going along or improvisation, or thinking about the sensual capacities of navigating barriers, walls, obstructions, and so on, as best one can? So other language for talking about resistance. And I think the affective turn helps in that way, just for the invigorating way that it's trying to deal with everyday life, or those that field of addressing everyday life. So that's something that some of the geography work is offering me, but geography tends to re-territorialize around national containers, which IPS doesn't. So some work that helps bring affect and the transversal together would be really useful and generative for me right now. So how to combine that kind of thick description that I find in the geographies of affect with thinking across societies or across nations and cultures, or thinking this space of the international as well, which personally I find quite lost in the public discourse in the UK at the moment. Again, that may be just what it feels like to be here right now, and it's not the case elsewhere.
Thanks, Ankara. Not sure we speak all about the same, the international, when we talk about the international, but that's a point for discussion. I have a few points generally that I think are issues of discussion here, which come back to resistance, opposition, disjunction, structure, struggle, change, and so on, and agency, but we can come back to that maybe. Let's first open if people have questions, remarks in the second round. We're not going to make it through all our questions. I'll read all the questions for you so we can do another roundtable to do the other questions at some point maybe. But anyone, questions, comments, contributions? No? It's unfair for me to ask, I guess, but there is one. Alexandra?
Yes, hello once again. I would like to ask you, in general, all participants, what do you think about some of descriptive concepts of global governance, mainly in terms of approaching global governance in terms of research, but also in terms of theorizing political dynamics within this framework? I mean, for example, the idea of heterarchy, which is, I think, very close to transversality ideas, given that it refers to cutting across the logics of ordering, national boundaries, as well as changing shape of existing authorities. Could you say something or just comment on this?
We have no other person contributing at the moment. So anyone wants to pick this up? I have also a question, but it's unfair because I have another question, the other three on my list, but something I thought was, Debbie is there as well. But Debbie, let me finish. There's something I think to think about, because there's a lot of thinking about when we do the transversal. There's questions about, the question of how do you think agency? Didier said at some point, we don't think in the terms of the who, right? So there's all the relations that are there. There is a question of not thinking in terms of position and opposition. So the question becomes, how do you actually think terms like struggle, disjunction? If we don't think binary, how do we think the multiple or the heterogeneous or the non-binary without making it the homogeneous one, the unity? So I think there are some questions which are both political with regard to how do we understand the politics and therefore power. I mean, therefore not, but power around notions of struggle and so on, disjunction and heterogeneity. And so what is a transversal agenda of this? Debbie?
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks so much to all the speakers. I just have a question about, I'm taken with transversality in a lot of ways, especially from the Glissant version of it. But I wanted to ask whether transversality goes far enough, because it seems to me what we're all circling around is the problems with stasis, or the problems with concepts that are static. And I think certainly from what Joao was trying to articulate through folding, that kind of active version, we're starting to get somewhere in terms of circulation and mobility. So that's what I think is transversality is starting to open up. But there is a risk in the sense that it still only gets us thinking about how we're positioned across different spaces. So this is the problem with, say, heterogeneity or multiplicity. That's still a static version. So what I haven't heard, which I'm surprised about in a way, or what I think maybe we might want to start thinking about, are questions about things like speed, pace, rhythm, slowness, so those more active kind of verbs that will get us out of, so yes to topology, but not a static form of it. So I just wanted to maybe get us to reflect on, we might be enlivened by notions of transversality. I mean, I certainly am, but what are the limits of it as well? Thank you.
Oops. Thanks, Debbie. Anyone wants to pick this up of the panel? Didier? Please wave your hand, panelists. Didier, you're mute. Okay.
Yeah. Debbie, I think it's an excellent question. That's why I use the terminology of dynamics and not static. And I think it's effectively central because the notion of dynamics, to the contrary of the I play with assemblage quite a lot for a while, but assemblage is interesting only if it's not the noun, if it's a process of deassembling, reassembling. And I think it's really important to see the dynamics at work. So to introduce, of course, speed, acceleration, and not only speed, and the transformation far from the equilibrium. So I step back to the old book of Prigogine and Stengers about dynamics far from the equilibrium. And I think that what I want to say with this notion of dynamics. But if you look at dynamics, they have specific form if they are logic of struggles, where you have antagonistic forces and not one linear form. That's where maybe I disagree a little bit with Rob, which insists a lot about straight lines. I'm interested about the force dynamics which create dynamics which are either centripetal or centrifugal. And that's a little bit the way I try to sketch the logic of, for me, of the international is a logic which is centrifugal in terms of power, and the logic of state and markets are the same, they are centripetal. So I may stop here, but I will explain a little bit how it works, but I think it's really crucial now to get a step apart from the topology if it's a static topology. And I agree with you that fold is already a move, but I think we can go even further about the time.
Any other panelists? No ideas? No? No?
That's a very good question, Debbie. I was going to say something in the next question, the third question. But I think it's a good point, because one of the problems Guattari faced when thinking about the transversal was how certain articulations, if you want, established between staff. He formulated the concept thinking about a clinical psychiatric clinic in which he worked, but about the analysts, the staff, and the patients, and the world outside. So he thought about transversality as a way of how these transversalities destabilize the power of the psychoanalysts. And he also deployed the concept to think about how microfascisms circulated in Europe. So he tries to, it has a lot to do with the relationship between micro fragments and how they become somehow macro structures. Well, structure is a bad word, right? Or some kind of macro politics. So the articulation between, microfascisms and certain general discourses about violence, discrimination. This is very in vogue here in Brazil. So it has a lot to do with the circulation. And when we use the fold, I think the next question is a little about this. So the fold, when Deleuze thought about the fold, it was really about that, you can call it a zone of intersections, not even intersection, right? But it's a zone where the inside and outside come together. Are you thinking about the Baroque house, right? So the second floor and the first floor. So how the inside is folded into, is a folding of the outside. So that has a lot to do of how these fragments, these micro practices, they circulate within the fold. So the fold is really about, mostly about movement. So it's good that you mentioned the static problem that we face when we think about any kind of structuring, right? It can be assemblages, structures, networks, and of course foldings would be subject to the same conundrum. But I do think that if we look into how Deleuze formulates the concept of the fold, he's really worried with multiplicities, points of view, perspectives, and how the observer, and he made a good point, right? The observer can be at the same point, at the same moment, both a point of view, but at the same time a plurality. So that's where he really draws into Leibniz to think of the subject position as a plurality, which is, it's very interesting, and a bit complicated the way he does it. So I think the fold is, if you want, the best, not the best, but one of the most interesting ways Deleuze think about multiplicities, privileging movement. Sorry, this was a very long answer and probably not very clear.
Thanks, Joao. I think, we've got 15 minutes left. What I propose is that if people want to pick the questions we had, I think they've been touched upon partly as well. It's about how in the transversality you actually think power in a decentered way. How do you conceptualize through your concept, and how do you translate this methodologically into transversal modes of reading, writing, and composing? What I propose we do is, I know that Didier definitely has to go. I'm usually quite flexible on this. We can go until 4 if people can stay for longer, but Didier needs to go early. So what I propose is that you pick your question here and make an intervention on what you actually think following out of what has been discussed we want to make in terms of transversality as a comment. And Didier, will start with you so you can go when you have to go lecturing, right? Mm-hmm. Good. So let's start with Didier and then I'll move around in the list. And so just pick an element that you want to raise around transversality.
Oh, yes, I will begin with the discussion we had already with Debbie and Joao. I think that my way of analyzing now is to prefer the notion of dynamics and to make the difference between centripetal and centrifugal dynamic. So if you remember what it means for people who are not aware, centripetal dynamics are dynamics which will reinforce always the center, and they will turn and create more and more power, where the power will be reinforced at the center and dispersion on the margin or exclusion of the margin. And in that case, of course, you have the metaphor by excellence for state making. And that's a question by which you have form of double constitution of forces between the creation of armies, permanent armies, and taxation. And that's, of course, the traditional work of Charles Tilly, Norbert Elias, Max Weber, Bourdieu, Ebermeier, and also the one considering market, from competition to oligopoly to monopoly. And these two forces are also always considered as what we call globalization, as what we visibilize as the international. But that's a paradox, because if you think that, it's just the growth of the very same phenomenon. What I call power and centrifugal logics are the logic where the actors who are on the margins are more and more powerful. They deconstruct what was the center. And so you have a different process. And in some way, not only it goes as resistance, but also strategies of escape, or they are just alternative. To give you some example, James Scott recently on Nomia show how other forms of dynamics have set a place against the state or organizing their social relation just differently. It was also the intuition of Pierre Clast, society against the state where the state is not yet existing. It's also the discussion with Etienne de la Boétie about the modality of servitude where you don't have a logic of state. So what is at work is really that state and market in Western countries are always in centripetal logic, but we need really a lot of research about where you don't have this form of reinforcement of the center, where you had, and it has been the case, of course, concerning the logic of escape in Africa, where the power relations are not in favor of struggling against a power domination to create a state, but to escape. Or in Asia, and that's also a sort of way of reorganizing differently. The Asia, not the Asia of major states, but the one discussed by James Scott recently. That's also the strategy of diaspora, when the diaspora are not repeating the logic of their country of origin or destination. That's also metaphorically the logic of the digital, where you have, at least at the beginning, people who were in possibility to not accept the logic of centripetal logic of state and market. And it was maybe something that was at the beginning, but not now. In my own research about police and intelligence services, which are considered at the very core of state-making organization of centripetal logic, I have tried to show that you have other logic, centrifugal logic. For example, the creation of transnational guilds based against nationalism, based on solidarities of work, of know-how. And of course, in that case, I'm sure that this notion is really connected with the one of force, because there are dynamics which reframe and reorganize the logics of organization. So I stop there. I hope I was not too confused by stretching everything together.
Thanks, Didier. No, not at all confusing, at least not for me. Angarat?
Okay, I'll try, thank you. I found that question really helpful, Debbie, on where we might be getting stuck with transversality and how to think more about the liveliness of things and relations. I was reminded of Jerry Pratt's contribution to Antipodes Journal at 50, where she talked about wriggle room and wriggling. That's quite useful too. There's also quite a lot around at the moment about working with discomfort, or an ethic of discomfort. So how do we work, or how do we theorize without any sort of stable grounds to guide us? It feels like we're living through that kind of moment again, doesn't it? When there are lots of the ways we had of making sense of the world are collapsing around us, and we need new vocabularies. So the person I turned to in order to try and think about this through affect, although I'd say that obviously we need more than one concept to get at any of these problems, and one alone is not enough. But I turned to Eve Sedgwick's work in Touching Feeling from 2003, where she talks in a way that resonates with Michel Foucault's point about cutting off the king's head in political theory. She asks, what would it mean then to do something other than expose or reveal hidden structures at work? So if we know the violences around us, or if many of those violences are already visible, then what does critical theory do? And interestingly, relating back to Debbie's point, she says that critical theory sometimes makes our view of the world look settled as well, and therefore that risks making us immune to how it can surprise us. So she challenges us to think about methods that might remain open to the surprises of the world, that we haven't already got very certain theoretical frameworks that make us immune to those surprises. So I like that, and I find it quite helpful. And because we've had lots of references against kind of thinking beyond, or going from inside to outside, or seeking redemption through theory, one of the concepts she presents is to think beside, which is quite interesting. And she says there's nothing very dualistic about a beside. So what would it mean to settle beside a structure or a relationship, or to follow something from the side? How would that yield a different kind of view of what might be going on around us? A very final point, something that's interested me in terms of think about how we do this methodologically, and I think you asked us about forms of writing, Jeff, or forms of doing this work, is thinking about trying to combine experience and abstraction. So rather than, often the move away from abstraction is to insist that experience is more originary, perhaps, or to refute experience and or storytelling altogether, to go to abstraction. So I've been trying to think about how to bring both of these together as different ways of engaging the world. But that's, tying into debates taking place in the Paris Journal about the style of writing about international politics, and experimenting with these styles to try and get at other ways of capturing what's going on, and again capturing that liveliness and the fact that things are very much in flux.
Thank you, Ankerat. Who's next on? Jonathan, you're next on the list.
Yep, thank you very much. So I have a lot of notes, and this is going to be incredibly incoherent because I'm not sure which question to respond to now. So I'm just going to skip through different points at different things, and probably come back to Debbie's comment on movement, etc. at some point. So I'll try and probably do a little bit on each of the last questions, one way or the other. So talking about these questions of power that keep coming up. So I agree fully that we need more than one concept. So I don't really want to focus around the particular concept that I'm talking about necessarily, but I also want to touch on the fact that a lot of the things we talk about, whatever concept terminology we're using, there's still a certain divorce from the human going on in a certain level, which is interesting. This question about whether we're talking about who or what, we want to move away from an idea of agency being settled in the who, etc. But I want to connect this slightly to issues of power. So the question of the unthought within politics, the ways in which power is significantly invested in the ways that agency is often a distributed effect, and we don't think about what we're doing. So how do we move away from scholastic visions or understandings of power, not simply in terms of intentionality, but going back to psychoanalysis, moving forward now, a lot of people are alarmingly talking extensively about neuroscience. I don't think we need to go there. I think the literature on affect is very nice in terms of how it talks about these ways in which we're prompted into different feelings, but also actions. And power, I think, is very much invested in that kind of sticky way. These web ecologies of relations create these unthought processes at different levels, which distribute both agency, power, and responsibility in different ways, and often lead to that image of staticness one way or another, which I'll come back to. But then on the fourth question, so yeah, this connects a lot to the question of structure. So the sticky engagements that I talked about at the beginning, and that's and a thing in terms of how things are compressed and composed together in a way that force both unthought processes, but also structural events, dynamics, turbulences, etc. That's how I think about this through composition, in terms of the stickiness of the world, in which power largely rests in how it precisely folds us in different ways. That it's very much resting on how much it can fold within to itself in terms of these particular centrifugal dynamics, etc. I very much like that and the fold metaphor. And the question then to me in terms of practice, to come back to the just discussion we had in terms of the methodology of IR and how we do things. I mean, my question is largely again about how we move away from the intellectualist vision of methodologies one way or the other. So writing styles and the piece in Paris is very important, but also moving this further. And so to go back to Debbie's point, one of the things I found most useful in reading recently, although equally didn't understand it all, much of it, was Erin Manning's work drawing on Deleuze on movement, dance, and pre-acceleration in particular, and the ways in which our actions and our effects pre-accelerate us towards particular actions in the world. And of course, she draws on the example of dance and how you already know what your body knows what it's going to do before it happens. It's pre-accelerated into that process. But politics follows the same kind of logic in lots of ways. And so the question for political praxis within IPS to me is how can we engage in forms of writing, but also other forms of practice, whether visual, material, that engage some kind of pre-accelerative and so prefigurative politics in terms of what we want to move towards. And I don't have very clear answers to how that would work, but that's my kind of question, one way or the other. And to go back to the question that somebody raised earlier, Alexandra, I think, in terms of different literatures which touch on transversality in different ways. I think one of the key things at the moment for IPS to move forward will precisely be making linkages with other fields one way or the other, whether we're talking about more traditional IR fields or different things, because there are a lot of convergences across disciplines, across people doing different subfields, across different geographical locations. And I think it's very crucial that we make IPS more transversal itself in that sense, that we find ways of drawing these linkages. So I do see a lot of connections. Sometimes I read, I think I mentioned this last time we had a workshop, sometimes I read international organization, and if you look at the footnotes, I mean, they're talking about effect and they're talking about different things. So my question to some degree is how, I don't really agree with how they're doing it, but that doesn't really matter. How do we bring them into composition with us one way or the other? That was a long rambling rant, but I'll stop and pass on to Jeff, who's we passing on to.
I'll pass it on to Linda. Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think I will just focus on the last question about methodology, because time, and I think Jonathan tried to rush through all, so I will just focus on one thing. I think one of the main challenges if we write up a transversal analysis is this idea of how we can keep the complexity and keep this idea that there is a multiplicity, but then of course when one writes up, goodbye Dicky. Yeah, so how to keep this multiplicity and not, especially when it comes to controversies, to not simplify it in a way that it becomes a pro-con debate, that it becomes like the simple opposition of like two subjects that disagree, but one keeps also these different layers and these different ways in which imaginaries link all kinds of different entities that might operate on different scales and on different planes of action. And I find that when one writes this up, this is the core challenge, to present it then in a way to keep it, but of course one has to simplify it because it's not, no one wants to read our research notes. So I find that, especially when it comes to controversies, a core challenge. But I would think for transversal analysis in general, I think even though there's an ongoing conversation about creative methods, I have the feeling that we have not, like, that's not the end of the conversation yet. And I think there has to have like more reflection on like how to keep this complexity and the multiplicity when writing, I think is a core challenge.
Thanks, Linda. Joao? Microphone.
Jeez, sorry about that. I'll be very brief. Just to say that I think it was very good that Jonathan and Debbie mentions, and Didier also, that we should not rely on transversality in itself as something that can convey a dynamic of change in itself. So because the transversal can be thought also as a diagonal line that does nothing much other than connect through a straight line different fields or different levels. And we probably should go beyond that, of thinking about the transversal. It's just something that does what IR doesn't do, which is offer us some kind of concept to think beyond the levels of analysis. And here, you know, the state, the region, or the global. Of course, that would lead us into a trap, or thinking we can go from here to there, from the local to the global, the micro to the macro. So we do have work to do on the transversal. And here, I think Jonathan made a good point when he thinks about transversal as a practice as well. It reminded me a bit of what Guattari tried to do in '92 when he ran as a candidate for the Green Party in France. But he articulated his candidacy transversing through different factions within the Green Party, right? And that led him to defeat, of course, right? So it's a practice that presents lots of problems and risks, even for us who think about transversality as a way of articulating knowledge through different either disciplines or ways of knowing, because if we follow the line of flight, it does disarticulate. I mean, it does unfold the places from where we speak, or subjectivities and structures of knowledge and power. So it's we need to go further along these lines and think about transversality as a practice that may be positive, constructive in the sense of affirming productive ways of engaging with the multiplicity, with the heterogeneity. This is very hard. That's where, you know, the whole problem of resistance and opposition comes into here. And I always refer to Martina Tazzioli's excellent work on the multiplicity and migration, where there are very interesting points made there about how hard it is for some kind of collective subjectivity emerge within the multiplicity of the flows of migrants. At the same time, those flows are an excellent case to make about how these flows can constitute folds or foldings that emerge as all kinds of different practices and policies that cannot be divided between inside and outside. So there's a lot of intersection and transversality in studies of migration. At the same time, it poses a problem for politics and politics of resistance in particular. So anyway, this is rambling as well, but I think transversality is a concept we should develop because it's really about how we start with movement and how we study the ways movement or flows are sectioned or limited or channeled and so forth. So it's a good way of inserting dynamism or speed, as Debbie was suggesting, in the way we think about politics.
Thank you, Joe. We're coming to the end. I mean, I had originally thought about 4 o'clock, but I said I reduced to 15 minutes. If anyone has a question, since it's an ongoing conversation, I do not necessarily think we need to have always the answers. I'll do a 2-minute summing up, which is going to say nothing at it. But I think there were a number of very interesting things, very important things raised for us to take the discussion forward. Does anyone have a comment, a contribution, something that helps us take? Because we'll continue this conversation. Hopefully this will continue. At least Joao and I will definitely continue that in the EISA section in the next 2 roundtables that we've set up there. But there will be other things coming. For example, the IPS Winter School in Rio. We will do some follow up on this discussion probably too. So if you got comments, contributions, this is the moment, because otherwise I'll conclude the roundtable. No, nobody? There was a question of Alexander.
I think Veronica is raising her hand.
Ah, okay. Just I can't see that here.
Thank you. It's very brief. I just wanted to clarify, my question was regarding my PhD thesis, in which there's this talk that as a developing country in Brazil, there are places that are located within the national territory that are constantly treated by the state as outsides. So they are geographically inside, but outside of the control of the state, if you think about it in terms of de facto control. So that was my question, where it was coming from. But that's just the clarification, and to leave a reflection for maybe further debate, that we can think of cases and examples like that. Thank you.
Yeah, we should certainly do it. I agree. Renata, do you see anyone else? Because I seem to be missing some of the hands. No? No, then I think we're going to conclude. I mean, thank you all very much for joining. It was, for me, it was very productive to think this through. I've got a set of new concepts to think through around the transversal. I hope you get some as well. And then, as I said, keep an eye on the DoingIPS website and some other of the websites that work around IPS, because there will be other things coming around this. One of the things that I take around transversality is that what I took from the workshop that came, well, from the panel that came out of it, is that rather than starting from borders and boundaries, next time it might be interesting to start from dynamics, movement, and flows, and see where we get if we go from there. So I thought that might be one way of another way in. That is not the traditional way we come to it. I think if you come from IR, where one think more into how do we go beyond borders, boundaries, and so on. And I think the concepts that were in play here, like composition, affect dynamics, centrifugal dynamics, foldings, controversies, actually will do some of that work, and it would be interesting to see it happen. The other one I picked up, because nobody actually talked a lot about dichotomies and binaries, but it's also how do you actually think beyond the not within the binaries, right? So what is not, so plasticity, how do you think about plasticity, folding, and so on? But the binary sets a whole challenge on how you think politics. Because if you think in politics, in classical critical politics, it's very often oppositional politics. So it's in an opposition from one to the other. And so how do you think, what conception of politics, if you think IPS coming out of a critical lineage, a critical politics that doesn't position in an opposition, right? How do you work that? And that's something I took out because there was a lot of limited reference to agency, questions of who, the question of not positioning, the question of, and so on. So I think this is another way we could come in about, and that is the question about what kind of politics is possible, or critical politics, or does that term even make sense, as Ankaret at some point raised as well, not around politics, but more generally, what can criticality be? But I think there's a notion of critical politics that comes in. And so I think we'll take this further, and I hope you guys will contribute as well in the future with papers and other things in this ongoing discussion that we will have. But for now, thanks all, and thank you to the contributors for excellent contributions, and for the people who jumped in. See you all next time.
Organizing.
Yeah, bye.